Hello, students. I hope everybody is doing fabulous today. It's really hot outside, and let's see if we can't hammer out a short lecture on the Cold War, okay? So I hope I'm talking loud enough. I hope everybody can hear me. I have the volumes turned up, the recording volumes turned up all the way, so hopefully everything will be great. Okay, so this is a lecture that corresponds, or the video lecture that corresponds with chapter 28 in OpenStack, Post-War Prosperity and Cold War Fears of 1954 to 1960. Most of all of Unit 3 will be over the Cold War, and I happen to like the Cold War very much, okay? Now, again, in chapter 28, and it'd be good for you either to listen to it and or to, for the most part, listen to this lecture. So one of the things that we have to look at first, as I always ask you all, is that, as you know by now, according to me and other professors, we believe that the Cold War began in October of 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution, okay? And that is, for the most part, what we really feel happened. And I do believe that. That's when we had the first Red Scare in the 1950s. We're going to have the second Red Scare. Now, two things that we need to keep in mind prior to the actual beginning of the Cold War. We're going to have Yalta in February of 1945, where FDR, Churchill, and Stalin are going to meet and talk about the division of Germany after the war, okay? And the other thing it's going to be, it's a Potsdam conference, and that is in July of 1945. Again, now it's going to be Truman, Stalin, and Churchill. And they're going to talk about how to rebuild Europe. Because, not Europe, I'm sorry, Germany, and Europe also, I'm sorry. They're going to divide Germany into three sections, and then they're going to divide Berlin into three sections, okay? The French, the British, the American, and the Russian. So it's actually four sections, okay? British, French, American, and Russia. I didn't mean to exclude the Russians, okay? And half of Germany, or Germany is going to get literally cut in half, where the Soviets or the Russians, and I use that interchangeably, are going to keep both Poland and Eastern Germany. But remember, it's going to be a problem because Berlin is in Eastern Germany. Now remember, this is just a synopsis, and you are responsible for reading up the lecture notes and, of course, listening to or reading the OpenStack and connecting things together. There's also a very good documentary, or two documentaries, that you can look at. So in Potsdam, the fundamental disagreement is going to be over the control of Europe, war reparations, economic aid, nuclear armament, and, right, the atomic bomb. The United States has an atomic bomb. They used it in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, August the 6th in Hiroshima, and I believe August the 9th in Nagasaki. But after that, the United States doesn't have any more, and you're going to have an arms race that's going to start. Now, the key issue of the Cold War is who is going to control Europe. Now, of course, the Russians want to control as much of Europe as they can because they don't ever want to get attacked the way they did again. So, but like when Hitler did it. So what they want to create is they want to create a buffer zone. They want to create a buffer zone and they want to create a buffer zone in the countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Albania, Greece. Now remember also the Russians don't have access to warm water ports. To the northwest, they've got Finland, Sweden, and Norway, and they have to get into in order to get to the North Sea, they have to go in that waterway, part of the North Sea. And if they want to get to the Mediterranean, they have to go through the Black Sea, and then they have to go either through the Straits of Gibraltar, or they have to go through Turkey. This does not really have a port to get to the Mediterranean. So they don't have access to the Mediterranean. They do not have access to a warm water port, or they have to cart goods all the way across the Soviet Union, which is almost impossible. So aside from having the issue of not being able to get to a warm water port, they also have the issue of a buffer zone. And I don't blame them. I do not blame them at all. You know, the United States is going to demand self-determination for some of these countries through elections. But of course, Stalin is not going to allow that. He's going to create satellite nations with puppet governments in order to protect himself. And of course, this is where Churchill is going to coin the term when he gives a speech in the University of Missouri. He's going to say, "We have been surrounded by an iron curtain." Okay, so one of the things that that most of us need to, wrap our head around is that this is an economic battle. This is an economic war. So while the United States and United States investors and banks are pumping money into the rebuilding of Europe, they're going to hold back from giving it to the Russians if the Russians don't do what they say they're going to do. In other words, give back Europe. The Russians are still bitter about, not being provided the economic aid that they wish that they had right before they were attacked by Germany, which of course the United States was not going to allow them to take complete advantage of the Lend-Lease program, because they had signed a treaty with Germany. They did. So you will have non-aggression pacts like the Munich Agreement in 1938, and then of course Hitler and the Soviets, actually Molotov and Ribbentrop Pact, where they agree to 10 years of peace, and the Germans pretty much give the Russians a free hand in controlling places in Eastern Europe. I think I have it written down here. Let me look to make sure. It would be like Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Poland, Romania. So you're going to have a deal that's going to go on between the Russians and Germany, and then of course Germany is going to violate it and attack Russia. But remember, because Russia made these treaties with Germany, the United States was never very happy. Okay, so that is also something that's going to start the Cold War. We also have the nuclear arms race. 43, it begins in 1943 with the detonation of an atomic bomb, and then of course the Baruch Plan in 1946 is going to ask for a disarmament. But it's not going to happen. The United States is going to develop a nuclear bomb, and then they're going to come up with a hydrogen bomb, and then of course Soviets are going to, through spy, are going to acquire a nuclear weapon, and then the United States detonates a hydrogen bomb, so the United States still has an edge on them. But then the Soviets are going to detonate a hydrogen bomb, so it's going to be a tit for tat of nuclear armament. Okay. One of the things, the concept that I want you all to firmly wrap your head around, or to understand, in 1947, George C. Marshall was appointed Secretary of State, and he called for the containment of Russia's expansive tendencies. He pretty much says, if we can contain communism to the spheres of influence, it'll die a death of its own. You're also going to have the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organizations, and it starts with the United States, Canada, and most of the Western European countries. Okay, now the first test is going to be in 1947 with the Truman Doctrine. You have Greece and Turkey that are on the brink of either becoming communist or democratic. And what Truman does is that he says the support of peoples throughout the world who are going to resist subjugation is absolutely necessary. And what Truman does is that he gives aid to Greece and to Turkey, and to influence elections, and elections become democratic. So that's like the first big win for Truman. When they see that that's so effective, Marshall then decides that what they're going to do is that they're going to implement the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan is basically going to pour in massive amounts of industry and money and aid into Europe. And believe it or not, the United States offers aid to Russia, but Russia refuses. Hardline communist countries that are not okay with Stalin, like Yugoslavia and Marshal Tito, they do receive money. And if you look at the lecture notes, it'll show you which countries received more money. So the Soviets were not happy about that. They were not happy that the United States was using economics, rebuilding industry, and money to influence elections, and it works. It's very, very, very effective. Okay, so with that said, now we're going to focus on the ways that the Russians are going to retaliate against the United States. Remember, they call it the Cold War because there's never really an exchange of, there's not actual fighting that goes on until we get to Korea, and then of course Vietnam. So, how are the Russians, the Soviets, going to retaliate? Well, the first thing big thing that we see is that we're going to see the Berlin blockade. So, remember, I told you, if you look at a map that's there on the lecture notes, Berlin is in Eastern Germany, and Eastern Germany is controlled by the Soviets. So, when they get Berlin, they divide Berlin into four parts. So, there's West Berlin and East Berlin. West Berlin is France, Great Britain, and the United States. Okay. And what we'll see here is that there's a 200-mile road, approximately 200-mile road that goes there, and Stalin blocks it. And he says, you cannot send supplies anymore. So what Truman does is that he orders a massive airlift. What does Stalin say? If you send those planes, we're going to shoot them down. And of course, Truman says, well, if you do that, in so many words, I don't know if this is exactly what he said. In so many words, he says, if you do that, then we will nuke you. We will, be war again. Uh, but of course, in 1949, because of the airlift, the Russians suspend and end the blockade. So this is another victory for the United States. Truman Doctrine, okay, Greece, Turkey, Marshall Plan, and now the Berlin blockade. So there's four things that Truman is on a roll, okay? Now we're going to see the expansion of uh, the nuclear arms race. In 1947, of course, the arms race is accelerated. And it's accelerated because we begin to realize that the Russians now have a nuclear weapon, and they've detonated they're going to detonate one in 1949. In 1949, I'm pretty sure. Yes, in 1949. So one of the things that happens is there is a telegram, an NSC 68, right? And NSC 68, it's based on the premise that the Soviets are going to start an arms race, when in reality it was the United States that was starting the arms race. And what they're going to do is that they're going to try to impose the views of communism in all the world. So what happens here is that there is proposed by the military that they increase military by spending by 300% in spending. And Truman says, absolutely not. Under no circumstances, okay? NSC 68 is National Security Council Act number 68 in 1947. And in a long telegram, they say pretty much that the only way that we can win, the most effective way to beat the Soviets is to outspend them, to contain them and outspend them. Now, under NSC 68, we're going to have the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency, which is a intelligence gathering agency for the United States. And the National Security Council is going to advise the president on what's going on. Now, in 1949, the president is still reluctant about spending money, 300%. And in 1949, the Russians are going to detonate their first atomic bomb. So Truman says, okay, develop a hydrogen bomb. We need to have a better. So now we're going to have more and more. And with Korea, it's really going to take off. Now, the Cold War in Asia, because remember, the Cold War is going on in Asia, Latin America, in the Middle East. It's really going to spread because it's going to have the United States and Russia that are trying to compete to have bases and access to ports. In 1945, of course, Japan consolidates its hold and forms a constitutional democracy, and there is a civil war in China. So the United States is able to be successful in Japan to create a democracy. And in China, the United States is going to support Chiang Kai-shek, who's a nationalist, right? But in 1949, believe it or not, Mao Zedong, a communist, is going to bring China into the Soviet orbit. But let me make one thing clear. Just because they were both communists didn't mean that the Chinese and the Russians loved each other, under no circumstances. They were just like, they had a common enemy, which was the United States. So what's going to happen is that Truman is not going to recognize communist China, and it's going to start building up Japan. And what happens is that Chiang Kai-shek is going to flee to Formosa, which is now present-day Taiwan. Okay, so we've got China over here, right, under Mao Zedong. You got Chiang Kai-shek that left, and now we have an issue with Korea, which is North Korea and South Korea. North and South Korea it's a peninsula surrounded with ocean on both sides, and of course the north, which is closer to China, is associated themselves with communism, and of course in North Korea we're gonna have Kim Il Sung, okay, which is the first of the Kims, and he, of course, Kim Il Sung, is going to blatantly attack South Korea. And he is actually, at the beginning, he's going to do fairly well. Now, here's what happens. Truman goes to, makes an argument in Congress, and they go to the UN, United Nations, and to NATO, of sending in troops, not just U.S. troops, but some other European troops as well. I don't know the exact number of the, and what the United States does under NATO forces is that they absolutely and positively rout the North Koreans, okay? And what happens is that they're going to push them all the way up, really close to the Yalu River. And um, General MacArthur is overconfident, and he gives Truman really bad advice, okay? The Chinese say, if you get really close to the Yalu River, we're going to invade, we're going to attack, a defensive attack, and guess what happens? They do eventually get really close. What you're going to have is that in October of 1950, it's going to be the first phase of the Chinese offensive, and the U.S. is hit in the places of Unsan, and I think, believe it or not, I have it down here, Sudong. Later on, you're going to have the Battle of Chosin, which is November of 1950, and then, of course, if you can see on the map here, you're going to see that Chinese forces are going to push the NATO forces all the way back to the Pusan perimeter. And this is going to be not a good thing. And then what happens here is that, of course, then later, okay, what we're going to have here, what's going to happen, the United States is gradually going to fight back and push North Vietnamese and Chinese forces back to the 38th parallel. So remember, in September 15th of 1950, you have the Incheon landing in Seoul. And then in October, because the United States pushes all the way up to the Yalu River, then the Chinese attack back. And then in November, you have the Battle of Chosin, okay? So there's a map there that shows the furthest advance. And it's going to be the furthest UN advance is going to be in November of 1950. And what basically happens here is that then the Korean War, the Korean conflict, is going to settle at the 38th parallel. And for the next 3 years and change, they're just going to go fight each other. It's an extreme cost for the Chinese and the North Koreans. And eventually in 1953, they agree that they're going to split it at the 38th parallel, and you have South Korea and North Korea. So that is not going to be a good thing for the United States. It's going to be somewhat of a black eye on the United States, okay? And it's actually, the United States realizes that it's not going to be as easy as they thought it would be to combat communism. Now, the Cold War at home, Truman tries to perpetuate the New Deal, but it doesn't work out for him. Republicans are going to attack Democrats using anti-communism techniques and stuff like that. That's going to be very popular. In the election of 1948, the Republicans are going to pick Thomas Dewey, and everybody thinks that Dewey is going to win. And of course, there's a very famous picture of President Truman holding up a newspaper that says Dewey defeats Truman. Actually not. Truman wins. Why? They're happy the way he handled Berlin, Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, what's going on in Europe. They're even somewhat, we don't have, anything going on in Korea yet. So he's going to get reelected in 48, and then Korea falls on his lap. Now, what's going on as far as domestic issues? You have the House of Un-American Committees, or known as HUAC, that is led by, my mind has gone blank, I'm sorry, Joseph McCarthy, okay? And of course, they are concerned with communism, and they believe that the Soviets are spying, and they are. You have men like Alger Hiss that are not really deep spies, but they're spies. You also have the Democrats are blamed for losing China to communism because the Russians have a hydrogen bomb. And of course, you have Julius and Ethel Rosenberg that are going to get executed for passing American atomic secrets to the Soviets. And they were, you know. So in 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy launches this anti communist campaign, and it's a witch hunt. He criticizes, he goes after people. His methods are criticized. He attacks bureaucrats, he attacks educators, he attacks people in Hollywood. And his idea was to defeat the army, defeat the enemy at home. They proposed that he had a list of 200 names of people that worked within the government that were card-carrying communists. Well, nobody ever produces that list. You know, people that are involved in here is Orson Welles, Richard Milhous Nixon. You know, eventually what happens with McCarthy is that even after the lives of so many people were destroyed, what ends up happening is that he begins to attack the army and tries to discredit the army and attacks some of the generals, saying that they are members of a communist plot. And that doesn't work out well for him, okay, at all. Now, there's going to be an election in 1952 because Truman's presidency expires in, early in 1953. And Truman is going to serve one full term and then the term that had belonged to FDR. Okay, so he does not choose to, he could have ran for another term because it's 2 consecutive terms, and he did like a little over 7 years or a little under 7 years, I don't remember. The next person that's going to win the presidency, believe it or not, is going to be Dwight D. Eisenhower. He is from Denison, Texas, as a matter of fact, and he says that he is going to win the war. Now, he is a very, very open, pragmatic Republican. He was in charge of the invasion of D-Day, so he knows the cost of human lives. He doesn't fear communism the way others do, but he realizes that it needs to be taken care of. And Eisenhower likes to work behind the scenes, okay? He wants to relax tensions with the Soviets, and he wants to reduce the debt that is imposed by defensive spending. And he also wants to reduce the feeling that atomic warfare is the only answer to that. But he also believes in massive retaliation. And the rise of the military-industrial complex, so it's kind of like, it's a new look, right? He does it, like he says, I don't want to really depend on atomic weapons, but his new look relies on massive retaliation to deter a Soviet attack. So maybe it's what he wanted to do is that he just wanted to make sure that they were really scared and they wouldn't. Now, kind of putting that on hold and then shifting in focus, in 1954, you have none other than Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. The French are in Vietnam. And in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the French are finally beginning to get kicked out of Vietnam. And in 1956, they're kicked out of Vietnam. And the United States slowly begins to get involved in Vietnam. Okay, the French are gone. It's a power vacuum. You have North Vietnam, South Vietnam. In the north, you have Ho Chi Minh. In the south, you're going to have Diem. I can never pronounce the name. It's Go Diem. One of these days, I'm going to ask somebody who speaks Vietnamese to teach me how to properly pronounce it. I just call him Diem. He was Catholic. He persecutes Buddhists. It's going to create a bunch of problems under the JFK administration. We'll put that on hold and talk about that later. In China, okay, by this time, Chiang Kai-shek has left to Formosa, and Eisenhower is not going to recognize China under Mao Zedong. But China is communist. It's full-fledged communist. They do cooperate with the Russians, but they're not really friends with them. They're not really concerned about their sphere, expanding their sphere. They're more concerned with, somewhat modernizing themselves under communism, if you want to say that. But we also have the Middle East, kind of churning. The Suez Canal was built by the French in 1869, and in 1869 and in 1956, Egyptian leader Gamal Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal, takes it away from the French and the British, and the British and the French attack Egypt in 1956. There's a war about a year and a half, and of course, Eisenhower persuades the French and the English to withdraw. And he kind of keeps that down. He kind of calms that. He says, hey, it really does belong to the Egyptians. So, you all it's better that you just let it go. And of course, Egyptians are going to let everybody use the, the canal, right? In 1958, Lebanon invites U.S. troops during a religious and political overthrow. Of course, the United States is going to get involved in Iran, the CIA in Iran, and they're going to put the Shah of Iran in power, and that's going to create some problems also later on. It's going to get overthrown. The Ayatollah Khomeini is going to get involved. In Guatemala, Eisenhower is involved in the CIA in the overthrowing of President Jacobo Arbenz, okay? And they install a guy by the name of Carlos Armas, okay? He's the first U.S.-backed authoritarian ruler in Guatemala in Operation PBS Success, or PB Success. It had nothing to do with PBS, okay? Now, of course, on the other hand, Eisenhower refuses to help East German protesters against Soviet domination, and he doesn't help Hungarian freedom fighters, okay, with what's going on in Hungary or Romania or East Berlin. He kind of just abandons them. Now, moving on here. What we got, of course, in 1953, I believe March of 1953, Stalin suffers a massive stroke and he dies. Well, there's still a lot of remnants of Stalin's regime, so you're not going to have another real secretary of the party until Nikita Khrushchev comes in 56. You're going to have, I forget the name of the other guy, Malenkov is going to be there, and then of course they're going to get rid of Joseph Beria. They're going to purge all the people that were almost involved in the purges that Stalin did, and what the approach that Khrushchev is going to take is far different. Okay, he is going to be very aggressive. He is going to, one of the things he's tells the United Nations Assembly, he tells the United States, we will bury you. He wants U.S. and Britain out of Berlin. Like, remember there's East Berlin and West Berlin within East Germany. He wants them out of there. And of course, in 1957, the Russians are going to launch Sputnik. And this is really going to alarm the United States, because now the Russians can put a satellite into space. They can put an intercontinental ballistic missile to space and then rain it down on the United States. The response to Sputnik, the creation of the National Aeronautic Space Administration, NASA, and the National Defense Education Act. It's like the beginning of STEM. Okay, upgrading the teaching of science in schools and start to fight wars smart with technology and not with boots on the ground. It's just, by the 1960s, the United States begins to feel a lot better because, of course, Sputnik and the Russia making some advances, they feel a sense of failure. But by 1960, it declines. Of course, in May of 1960, the Russians managed to shoot down a U-2 spy plane, which then reminds us that they have the ability to shoot missiles into the stratosphere. I believe that plane was in the stratosphere. It is the stratosphere. I'm sure it is. It was deep in the stratosphere, and they shoot this U-2 spy plane. And, of course, there was a summit that was going to take place to deal with the Berlin crisis. And Eisenhower is going to take responsibility that he gave authorization for the plane to fly those missions, but he does not apologize. So now we have a split again, right? So the Russians get the pilot, they parade him around. But the bottom line is that the Russians now have missiles that can fly into the stratosphere and that can hit planes up that high. Now, they just didn't shoot one missile. They shot a bunch, okay? Now, the continuance of the Cold War, Eisenhower emphasizes that he does not like the growth of the military-industrial complex and that he wants peace and tranquility. But he kind of contradicts himself, He allows the spending to go on. He allows these missions to go on. He allows the CIA to participate in covert operations. And then on the other hand, he says, no, but we want peace and tranquility. And that is kind of contradictory. Now, Eisenhower is going to be president. He's going to leave office in 1961 when John F. Kennedy is going to be sworn in as president. And let's look at the years of 1945 to 1960 when it comes to a rapid economic growth in the United States. We have a lot of consumer spending, consumer goods. In 1954, we're going to have the introduction of the first real credit card, which is going to be, I believe, it's Carta Blanca, I think. Uh, no, it's not Carta Blanca. It's Diners Club. There you go. It's Diners Club. I'm sorry. I'm a little foggy today. I hope you can forgive me for that. Heavy, heavy, heavy government spending, creation of the military-industrial complex, Lockheed, Bell Helicopter, Raytheon. All these companies are employing former veterans that are working there, building planes, developing new planes, new missiles, new helicopters. I mean, it is just a big boom. You have a baby boom. You have the shift of the middle class that goes into the suburbs that depend on automobiles. You know, the implementation of the interstate highway system under Eisenhower, which is really his one of his biggest contributions. Employment expands, suburb expands. We have the uh, advent of the shopping center, which is basically going to be like an uncovered mall. You have like an anchor store and then a bunch of other stores around. You have like an Academy or a TJ Maxx or something like that. And then you have a lot of other smaller stores, a record store, a toy store, a beauty shop, you know, pet stores, all that kind of stuff. You know, so the military builds up, you know, people get employed, you know, you have booming suburbs, you have the automobile, people are going on vacation. It is a good time in the United States. I mean, I mean, the wheels are coming off, and you look at the interstate highway system where people can now travel to Disneyland and California and all that. And you're also going to have um, the invention of the truck stop, and in addition to that, it's going to hurt small towns. With the first formal truck stop, not the first truck stop was invented like in 1928 or something like that. I think it was Dixie truck stop. But the first interstate big truck stop is going to be none other than Pilot in 1958. Okay. And this was because people were traveling more. Okay. So the United States, the Cold War is heightened. You know, Khrushchev is pissed off. He comes to the United States. They take him to a department store, you know, and of course Nixon takes him and he is criticizing the United States, but he loves it while he's here. People are curious, they go see him, and of course they have the interstate highway system that is moving people all over the place. Now, what's going on in the area of civil rights? You know, a lot of African Americans came back from World War II thinking that they were going to be treated equal, and unfortunately they weren't. And also Mexican Americans and women. You know, you have women after World War II that come back and they were building airplanes, flying airplanes, doing all sorts of stuff, training, instrument training, and all that. And now they have to go back to being women. Minorities need to go back to being minorities, and they expected a lot more from that. In 1948, Truman is going to integrate the um, Army, but little is done. In 1957, they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1957, but it has no power to enforce. Okay, 1955, the NAACP Secretary Rosa Parks is going to refuse to give up a seat on a bus, and you're going to start the Montgomery bus boycott riots. I mean, not riots, Montgomery bus boycotts, period. Martin Luther King is going to lead the boycotts, and Martin Luther King is going to go on a nonviolent protest against segregation. Okay, in 1960, you're going to have the sit-ins where African Americans are going to sit in lunch counters like at Woolworth and at Crest. And of course, 1963, you're going to have the March on Birmingham, and we will cover these more later on. And of course, in 1963, you're going to have MLK's March on Washington. So even amidst the Cold War, you're going to have these events where 55, you know, Montgomery bus boycott, 60, the sit-ins, 63, Birmingham, and 63, MLK's March on Washington with the I Have a Dream speech. And the other thing that you're looking at, 1954, we have the overturning of that horrible, horrible, horrible Supreme Court case, Plessy v. Ferguson with 1954, with Thurgood Marshall, with Brown v. Board of Education. It's segregation is unconstitutional. And the way that he attacks it is that he says it is not the responsibility of the United States to make sure that everybody gets an education, but it's the responsibility of the United States that everybody has equal access to education. Now, of course, they rule in his favor. Earl Warren, the Chief Justice, they rule in his favor, and they tell him, you must segregate, you must segregate, you must desegregate, you must desegregate with all deliberate speed. Well, that's like telling my 17-year-old, take out the trash, instead of take out the trash now, if not. You know what I mean? So even though you have desegregation in 1954, beginning in 1954, it's not really going to happen until 64 and 65 under LBJ. Other cases that you see is that you're going to see Miranda v. Arizona, which is the right of the accuser, and Reynolds Simmons, one person, one vote, right? There is massive resistance in the Deep South now because integration is very slow. And it's so slow that in 1957, Eisenhower is going to send troops in for the Little Rock Five. So even to defy uh, uh, the governor of Alabama to make sure that African Americans go to school, go to a public school in Little Rock. Now, of course, when it comes to Mexican Americans, what we see here going on is that you have in 1929, we have the creation of LULAC, the League of Latin American Citizens. All their meetings were in English. They said the Pledge of Allegiance. And in 46, they bring forth Mendez v. Westminster that outlaws the segregation of students is unconstitutional, and it's in California. In 48, we have Delgado Bastrop in Texas. And in 1954, the Delgado v. Bastrop and Mendez Westminster both have to do with school. In 1954, we're going to have Hernandez v. Texas, and it's the first case that extends the 14th Amendment. In the case of Hernandez actually killed somebody in a bar, and he is guilty. But the jury was all white. And because the jury was all white, he did not get a fair trial. They felt they didn't. So they went before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, yes, that's not supposed to be that way. He gets retried, and of course, he is going to get convicted for murder. I have two other cases, 62, which is United Farm Workers, and 1967, the Mexican American Youth Organization. But we're going to put those on hold. We're going into the 50s. I'm going to go into Kennedy a little bit. I'm going to go into Kennedy because, Kennedy is in chapter 29. And the Cold War is going to intensify under Kennedy. Remember, Eisenhower's vice president is Nixon. And in the election of 1960, you're going to have a debate between John F. Kennedy and Richard Milhous Nixon. Okay. Now, Kennedy is a Cold War warrior. Okay. He was in World War II. He wants to take a hard line against Russia. He wants to balance the nuclear conventional arsenal that the United States has. But he wants to then have conventional armed forces, a nuclear arsenal, and he's going to come up with the concept of special forces and the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps, I've had friends that are in their 80s now that were in the Peace Corps and say, we were essentially a spy organization for the United States under JFK. Now, of course, Khrushchev is going to test JFK because he's young, and the way he's going to do it is, of course, he's going to do it with the Cuban Missile Crisis in the Bay of Pigs. Now, the Bay of Pigs is going to be an absolute and complete fiasco. Okay, what happens is that Kennedy and the CIA decide that they're going to support some anti-Castro forces that are in exile. And what they're going to do is that they're going to invade Cuba through the Bay of Pigs, La Bahía de los Cochinos, okay? And they had formulated this plan under Eisenhower, but then Kennedy said, let's go do this. About 1,400 Cuban exiles, all board recreational boats, and they have weapons and all that. And they land there in the Bay of Pigs, and the Cubans are waiting for them. And of course, when this happens, JFK does not, the United States does not provide air support, and they're defeated in 48 hours. Now, Kennedy is going to take responsibility for the disaster. He is very defiant. He said, we had to do this. Cuba is under Castro, and, we have a communist nation way too close to the United States. We have 90 miles from Key West and 50 miles from the mainland. So under no circumstances did they want. He takes responsibility for the disaster, and it is one of those black eyes that we still have from the Cold War. Now, that's going to be in 61. In 62, we're going to have the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay? My dad was in the Cuban Missile Crisis, as a matter of fact. In 1962, the Russians are going to want to move missiles to Cuba, and it is confirmed. The ships were moving. They had missile launching pads, and Kennedy says no. And they put up a blockade, and of course, Kennedy threatens with a nuclear confrontation. And it said, we know that there are some missiles already there. You need to remove them, and you need to turn these ships around that you already have. Of course, the United States and Russia were on the brink of war. I do firmly believe that that is the closest that we have ever been to a nuclear holocaust. Evidently, Khrushchev did think that the United States was not playing, and in exchange for removing the missiles from Cuba, the United States would not invade Cuba and remove U.S. Jupiter missiles that were in Turkey. You remember, because we had a bunch of bases in Greece, Turkey, Germany, England, and we had our own forces really close to Russia, but we didn't want Russia to have forces close to us. I completely understand. Now, Kennedy matures. He increases in popularity for his stance. His negotiations regarding nuclear testing are all really good, but the Russians begin a naval and nuclear buildup. They start detonating more and more and more hydrogen, with the climax of them detonating the Tsar Bomba, which is the largest nuclear weapon ever. The United States, of course, at this time has a B-52s flying around. At any given time, there is a B-52 in the air within 200 miles of its striking target. 200, I think it was 200 miles of its proposed target. Let's put that one on pause. I better double check. Okay. I looked at my notes, and it's 8 to 12 hours from its intended target, not 200 miles. I'm terribly sorry. Please forgive me. And if I knew how to edit this, I would edit it. So the Russians do begin to build up naval and nuclear buildup. The Soviet-American hotline is finally set up. They have I don't know if it was red, but it's a hotline. And a lot of people believe that a hard line against the Soviets was justified, and the Cold War escalates under JFK. Now, of course, JFK gets involved in Vietnam, and this is where we will stop with the Cold War. Kennedy sees Southeast Asia as an area where he needs to focus. The United States under Kennedy is going to support Diem, but Diem and his brother and his administration is really heavy-handed. They're persecuting Buddhists. They are very corrupt. They're torturing people. And of course, what ends up happening is that the United States and Kennedy is going to, in 1963, authorize a coup against Diem. And Kennedy says, okay, but the coup is going to further destabilize South Vietnam. And the United States' involvement in Vietnam is going to deepen. It's going to really, really get worse. In his defense, JFK is going to inherit the Vietnam that was left by the Eisenhower administration. He's going to increase the American president from 900 advisors to about 1,600. In addition to that, he is going to, of course, approve the assassination of Diem. He is going to get very entangled in containment, and more importantly, he's going to continue to subscribe to the domino theory, that he believes that if Vietnam falls, that this will keep going. He's going to authorize the CIA to do some counterinsurgency against the Viet Cong, and it's going to get really nasty, and it's going to be set up to start deploying troops to full scale combat. Of course, now what begins to happen, and what we will talk about when we talk about civil rights, is that we're going to talk about the new frontier at home. Under Kennedy, his domestic initiatives are the new frontier. And he is a very competent activist. He wants economic reform. His cabinet is his greatest asset. He surrounds himself with the best and the brightest. His most controversial appointment is the appointment of his brother, Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, who he was very qualified for that. He is able to assemble a Southern Republican coalition when he picks Lyndon Baines Johnson to be his vice president. He does treat Lyndon Baines not very nice. Um, he increases space in defense spending. He sets an informal wage and price lines. He actually passes one of the biggest tax cuts ever in the United States for the middle class. This is under Kennedy, the middle class is doing really, really, really well. These economic tax cuts are going to increase growth by double and cut unemployment down. Okay, in civil rights, he's not going to do a whole bunch, because if he does anything for civil rights, he's going to lose the Southern vote. He's kind of caught in this conundrum, right? He does send federal marshals to protect freedom riders. He does send the National Guard to the University of Mississippi. Um, he is going to send the Deputy Attorney General to face down with Governor Wallace at the University of Alabama. But he downplays. In other words, he promises minorities a lot, and he basically gives little crumbs, as I've been told. The National Guard, of course, goes to Mississippi, and of course, like I said, Governor Wallace. Of course, unfortunately, November 22nd of 1963, Kennedy is going to get assassinated in downtown Dallas. Okay. Of course, he is going to come to Fort Worth, and then he goes to Dallas, and he gets assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. If anybody from Dallas ever makes fun of you because you live in Fort Worth, say, hey, say what you want, but when Kennedy left on November 22nd in the morning, he was still alive. And of course, Dallas has always had to bear that. The president that is going to come in is, of course, LBJ, and he's going to inherit yet the quagmire of Vietnam. He's going to promise that he is not going to increase any spending and troop deployment, and he is going to really increase troops deployment because under his administration we're going to have the Tet Offensive, we're going to have 1968, and we'll talk about that, make another separate lecture over Johnson, okay, or a separate mini lecture. This one's going into almost 50 minutes, and I think this is enough. So I hope this will help you all. This covers pretty much the Cold War from Truman all the way to John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and leaves us on the heels of of LBJ, and I'll do one for LBJ and then Nixon. You're going to see escalation during LBJ, and then you're going to see a plateauing a little bit for a while on the Nixon, and then Nixon, okay, decides that he's going to invade Cambodia. And that's just going to make things worse, So we're just in 1976, eventually the United States leaves finally. But pretty much from 68 to 72 to 76 is just 75. It just becomes a disaster. For the South will fall in 76. Anyway, I hope you all like this lecture. I hope it does you all some good. Let me know. Take care. Be kind to each other. Bye-bye.